Hi, this is Paul. This morning, Algo served me up this interview with Wesley Yang on Spiked, and I thought it was an excellent interview. Wesley, of course, is a is on Twitter, and read him quite a bit during sort of peak woke, anti-woke wars, and just thought I'd play it. And what's interesting about this is that his language has continued to be refined. His view of this phenomena, I think, has continued to sharpen. And as I listened to this interview, I thought, well, there's some points to accentuate here with respect to the question of religion and how human beings work in terms of that which is highest and how to pursue it. Um, in a lot of ways, partly because I'm a minister in a church, and to a certain degree because of what happened in the Christian Reformed Church between 2022 and 2025. A lot of the woke inflammation in the Christian Reformed Church has greatly receded. The community of people who had mouthpieces and pressures for certain agendas within the denomination, that what happened with same-sex marriage has sort of swept that away in many regards. But again, I thought listening to his language and sort of listening to this again, I found it quite helpful.
We're able to say, well, only a tiny proportion of people are really that woke. But actually,
Yes.
what you're getting across is this really is what they believe, what like a substantial proportion of people in charge believe.
It's a new institutional consensus, and it took a while for people to understand it. But the more the messaging gets rolled out and becomes pervasive, I think the more people are starting to understand that this is not just a student-led phenomenon. This is not a fringe phenomenon. This has been widely adopted by not just universities and schools of education and culture industries, but we hear the same messaging from corporations as well. It is the default language for the legitimization of the status quo. It's the language through which institutional power throughout the Western world sort of derives its warrant for its authority.
Yeah.
Derives its warrant for its authority. Now, I think in many ways, again, this has receded, but in other places, I hear plenty here in Sacramento, employees complaining quietly, people feeling that, well, this is just sort of this totalitarian regime. The title of this, he talks about the fact that this basically, you're denied choice with respect to this thing. This is the this is the assumed religion. He calls it the successor ideology. Now, of course, with Trump and with a lot of pushback, you see some pushback in some culture industries like Hollywood. You see some pushback in some corporate spaces. So it's, as Local Distance had said a number of years ago, this thing isn't just going to recede all of its own. There's going to be certain places where this stuff sort of continues on and continues to perpetuate it. Now, if we think about, let's say, a subtraction story like we might hear in, as let's say, atheists imagine religion would recede, you can sense some of those similar dynamics with this. That, well, Christianity didn't go away, belief in God didn't go away, belief in the supernatural didn't go away, but it sort of gets replaced. And I think that's, for me, still sort of the most pervasive frame. And the fact that he mentioned here authority was so important, because that's how a religion works. It's sort of the presumed, assumed authority. And just as you'll have this, let's say, this group of Muslims that believe that their religious assumptions are the authority which guide their lives. Christians of various stripes believe that this authority will guide their lives. This is something parallel to it. And again, there's certainly been recession in this, and I think we're going to continue to see recession in this, basically because it just didn't work, and people could sense it didn't work. But let's continue on. I want to hop to some other places in the video.
Institutional power throughout the Western world sort of derives its warrant for its authority.
Yeah, and you've described trans in particular as the apex of this, even more so perhaps than the sort of racial matters or gender matters.
Yeah, because it's the place where actual populations, right, become subsumed by an identity into which any disaffected person can identify themselves as. There's no definition of what it means to be a trans person other than says that they are a member of the opposite sex. And one is specifically sort of enjoined against saying that there's any other, determination for who belongs to this category of person other than self-identification.
Yeah.
And self-identification, of course, is written directly into law in many states, and that is the end goal. To have any person who declares themselves to be a woman to be recognized and treated as a woman. And so that's a conceptual shift because it poses the question of whether a person's counterfactual assertion about the self can impose an obligation on others, a duty of recognition onto others.
And right there again, you can tell that his thinking has just continued to sharpen and solidify, can impose a recognition on others, creates a duty for them. In other words, this again is very much sort of how religion has been framed. Let's say, well, I believe that the Bible is the word of God, therefore these things are illegitimate and these things are true and these things are not true. Part of what happens in let's say the rise of modernity is that there's the idea that everything should be distillable down to certain facts which can be justified foundationally and grounded in materiality. Now, that's not a dumb wish in some ways, because you might say, do I have a white remote control for a little camera stand thing in my hand? Yes or no? There's a factual statement. And of course, the vision is that if we can sort of build upon this, tower upon these factual statements, then we can arrive at certainty. And certainty in the service of public clarity, imagining that this will bring, well, this is where everything, of course, gets very religious. Imagining that this will bring what? Happiness, fulfillment, flourishing. But of course, happiness, fulfillment, flourishing aren't like this. And then, of course, sort of the turn to the psychological was the imagine that, well, if all psychology is sort of chemicals in the brain, then maybe we can what? Because instead of trying to arrange everything out in the world so that it would produce in us the chemical stimulation that would give us these feelings, are of course themselves just chemical arrangements. Why can't we stick a needle in our arms and blunt force those chemical arrangements through drugs, and then we would achieve our religion? And again, right here, you see that the religion just breaks down. And so maybe instead of having this trans demand out on the world, and I remember it was, I think it was Louise Perry had said, was it Louise Perry? Could have been. Had said, trans people live in this terror of children. And of course that rings true given the events that just recently happened. Well, why would trans people be terrified of children? Because maybe through social pressure you can bully all of the adults in society to say and define and recognize and do all those things as you demand, and you can put the power of government behind it to achieve that sense of things in the world, to stimulate in your mind the desired. Remember, again, for them, consciousness, this is all biochemical. So arrange the world so that the stimulation coming to me based on my background, I can then have this experience, which is fundamentally biochemical. I can have this experience of fullness and joy and realization. And someone might say, well, what if we could just shortcut that whole business? Because, of course, children are probably just going to say things that you don't like. So this was Michael's tweet. Jamie Lee Curtis says nobody knows which of her daughters is trans, and shouldn't have it any other way. Of course, this was before the attack. And Michael Martin says, well, that's a toughie. And those of you listening can't see it, but those of you watching, yeah. And so, well, what if instead you could just provoke that arrangement of the chemicals so that your consciousness would give you the desired outcome, or maybe you can just use heroin. Because, and this again is where this entire line that you hear of, well, because, we have to sort of break everything down to experience. And then, of course, why not just drugs? Just, drug you into the preferred experience and don't let you wake up. And this is sort of, Brave New World all over again with its soma. And, I think Yang is onto something here with respect to, and he's going to talk about liberation in a little bit, because that's really a key element of this post-war religion. This is a religion of liberation. And of course, it sort of has its roots in Rousseau that, well, the problem with society is that you can't get everybody to go along with the story. And so what we need to do is liberate people from liberate.
That the state can affirm and enforce.
Yeah.
And that's what's being determined in these various legal, political disputes in every state throughout the Western world, with some pushback in the United States at the moment. But there's a different state of play in different states, and of course in the United Kingdom right now, there is a movement where the Supreme Court found that the term sex in its equality legislation, in fact, was referring to biological sex.
Yeah.
And an effort was recently made by the Biden administration to overwrite sex with gender identity in the law that protects the rights of women within universities. And the same legislation has repeatedly been attempted. It's called the Equality Act. By virtually every member of the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives several times. And of course, this legislation would mean that in the place of schools under Title IX, it would mean that every school in the country from K through kindergarten through university would have to provide access to any boy or man who declares himself to be a woman to the women's private spaces, and to provide them with a right against discrimination to be referred to by their preferred pronouns. And the Equality Act would extend this anti-discrimination measure to every public accommodation in America. Now, the Title IX law was struck down by a judge who found it to be in violation of Title IX and in violation of the United States Constitution, right before the Biden administration left. And there is good reason to suspect that they would do the same with an Equality Act that the Democrats have repeatedly attempted to push through Congress, were it to pass. But nonetheless, self-identification, as the determinant of who and what is a woman, remains the horizon of possibility that the transgender movement seeks. And in seeking that, it's crossing, an important inflection point, an important threshold that would really change the nature of what it means to have a right. Because it wouldn't just be sort of a right to believe what you want to believe. It would be a right to compel others to believe or to acquiesce in their behavior what the individual wants to believe. So it's a kind of
And this is, I think Wesley's right that this is a sort of a fundamental element of liberalism, that you have limits on what you can compel others to believe. That doesn't mean that the government can never compel others to believe something. For example, if you're speeding and the police officer says you're speeding, you say, you can't make me believe I was speeding. No, but I can give you a ticket. And whether or not you actually believe that, I don't know. So, but this element, I think Yang is right, that here's one of these hallmarks of liberalism, that, well, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, and it grows from the fact that it's extraordinarily difficult to compel people to believe what they don't believe. And so with this particular issue, it hits that, that point.
warrant for the subordination of all to each. And so that's a kind of jumping off point, the end of the age of emancipation. Because either this project of sort of making it a right for others to accept my counterfactual assertions about my identity, right, as fact, and to treat it as such, and in my view, to make a false thing true, would mean that we no longer live in a liberal, pluralistic society where there is both a religious belief, a right to belief, and a right to unbelief. It would become a society in which one person's counterfactual assertions about the self would impose a duty upon others, right, of acquiescence. And this is very different than the various forms of, sacralization of identities that entail actual populations that can be sort of distinguished and determined by some, external characteristic. Because those other populations, like Black Americans, for example, are real populations with real needs and real interests that are not defined by an apparatus that purports.
And of course, when you had the woman that identified as African American, but the irony, of course, is that this line via skin color is in some ways different. It's easier in a sense to notice generally speaking, in the vast majority of cases, a biological male versus a biological female. It's a fairly easy thing to recognize and determine legally and physically. Yet, I loved how he put it, this age of emancipation.
To speak on their behalf. So even at the height of the George Floyd protests, polling of Black Americans said that most of them, a robust supermajority of them, wanted as much policing or more policing than the status quo was providing them.
And again, anybody who had been in the midst of the African American community knew this, and this thing comes out and it's like, what are you saying?
Yeah.
So there was this apparatus that controlled the media and the various institutions that said that the horizon of the future will be the defunding of the police and the abolition of the prison system, but ran up against the actual needs of an actual population that in the end turned out to be a question of municipal budget allocations, right? And it just turned out to be untenable when the various efforts, formal and informal, to either defund or culturally and morally delegitimize the act of policing and the provision of public safety, right, to marginalized communities who are owed this public good, right, could not, withstand the test of reality. Whereas a transgender population is one whose the very conditions of their existence as a distinct population are, in fact, created by, this kind of apparatus of social change that any person can identify into. And that population thus doesn't have a set of interests distinct from, what that apparatus says, right? And what that apparatus says is that we're going to cross a threshold about what it means to have a right, and so one of two things happens with this attempt to make a false thing true, which is either they succeed at their attempt, and they bring to a conclusion the liberal, pluralistic society that has been that has always been the kind of precondition for the pursuit of the project of emancipation.
Yeah.
And thus they bring the end of the project of emancipation to.
Okay, and he goes by it quickly, so let's back up and hear it again, because this age of emancipation, and I think he's framing it in a very compelling way.
To make a false thing true, which is either they succeed at their attempt, and they bring to a conclusion the liberal, pluralistic society that has been that has always been the kind of precondition for the pursuit of the project of emancipation.
Yeah.
And thus they bring the end of the project of emancipation to a close in that way.
So the liberal society, and when I look at, let's say, all the T-Grog's still out there on Twitter taking on all comers in terms of trying to get rid of religion. So, but the foundation is that you don't have to believe Jesus is Lord. The government will not compel you. Now, of course, Christians believe, you can read Philippians 2, that there will be a compelling spirit at the end of the age. But at this point, the government will not compel you to declare Jesus as Lord. But there's a line that's happening here where that freedom is sort of what liberalism offers. And of course, this is what sets up separation of church and state, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, all of these landmark things. And this issue then becomes sort of the edge of that. And beyond this, well, now we're no longer liberal, but we're post-liberal, and we're getting into this tyranny.
Way. And they've always been the kind of precondition for the pursuit of the project of emancipation.
Yeah.
And thus they bring the end of the project of emancipation to a close in that way, or they fail in their attempt to do that, and they demonstrate by their example that there is in fact no one left to emancipate in the traditional sense of emancipation, right? Having gone through, race.
There's no one. They become sort of the borderline where there's no one left to emancipate. And this is part of what you see with these emancipatory purity spirals, where you have microaggressions and you're not allowed to hurt my feelings. So why don't we go to peak debate?
You've said that men need to, quote, grow the hell up. Tell me why.
Well, because there's nothing uglier than an old infant. There's nothing good about it. People who don't grow up don't find the sort of meaning in their life that sustains them through difficult times, and they're certain to encounter difficult times. And they're left bitter and resentful and without purpose and adrift and hostile and resentful and vengeful and arrogant and deceitful and of no use to themselves and of no use to anyone else and no partner for a woman, and there's nothing in it that's good.
So you say, that's...
And again, what's so beautiful there is that, well, okay, but what's the problem with that? Why can't a drug-addled son live in the basement in peace? And maybe mom is happy that, well, at least he's safe laying there on the couch, and maybe we can recreate this drug soma that we find in Brave New World, and so that he can just have an enjoyable experience of being high in his mother's basement. But Jordan basically points to and says, but people don't want this for their sons. What do they want for their sons? There's a vision of the highest, and there's a way to get there. And just that my son I look at my son and he's lying, zoned out, drugged out on the sofa. Well, he's happy this way. Or, how many other different games. And then you get to what becomes sort of the climax of this conversation.
Empirical evidence. Like we know the traits that predict success.
But we also know, because companies by and large have not been dominated by women over the centuries, we have nothing to compare it to. It's an experiment.
True, and it could be the case that if companies modified their behavior and became more feminine, that they would be successful. But
You
there's
seem
no
doubtful about
evidence
that.
for it. I'm not neither doubtful nor non-doubtful. There's no evidence
So why
for
not
it.
give it a go, as the radical
Because the evidence
feminists would
suggests,
say?
well, it's fine. If someone wants to start a company and make it more feminine and compassionate, let's say, and caring in its overall orientation towards its workers and towards the marketplace, then that's a perfectly reasonable experiment to run. My point is that there is no evidence that those traits predict success in the workplace. And there's
Because
this
it's never
evidence
been
is-
tried.
Well, that's not really the case. Women have been in the workplace for what? At least ever since I've been around, the representation of women in the workplace has been about 50%. So we've run the experiment for a fairly reasonable period of time, but not, certainly not for centuries.
Let me move on to another debate that's been very controversial for you. And this is, you got in trouble for refusing to call trans men and women by their preferred personal pronouns.
No,
I want to
that's
ask-
not actually true. I got in trouble because I said I would not follow the compelled speech dictates of the federal and provincial government.
See, right there, he says that line that Wesley Yang is looking at, he said, that line is super important.
I actually never got in trouble for not calling anyone anything.
Right.
That didn't
You
happen.
wouldn't follow the change of law, which was designed
Not
to
once it was
outlaw
law.
discrimination.
No.
Why
Well,
should
that's
your...
what they said it was designed to do.
Okay, you cited freedom of speech in that. Why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended?
Because in order to be able to think, you have to risk being offensive. I mean, look at the conversation we're having right now. Like you're certainly willing to risk offending me in the pursuit of truth. Why should you have the right to do that? It's been rather uncomfortable.
Well, I'm very glad I put you on the spot. I'm very glad that I've
but you get
exercised
my
my freedom of
point.
speech.
You get my point. It's like you're doing what you should do, which is digging a bit to see what the hell's going on.
So
And
do
that is
you-
what you should do. But
And
you're
you-
exercising
so-
your freedom of speech to certainly risk offending me. And that's fine. I think more power to you as far as I'm concerned.
Except you haven't sat there and... I'm just trying to work that out. I mean,
Ha, gotcha.
you have got me. I'm trying to work
about
that through in
time.
my head. Yeah. It took a while.
It did, yeah.
Took a while. You have voluntarily come into this studio and agreed to be questioned.
Mm-hmm.
A trans person in your class has come to your class and said they want to be called
And that's never
she.
happened. And I would call them she.
So you would. So you've kind of changed your tune on that.
No, I said that right from the beginning. What I said at the beginning was that I was not going to cede the linguistic territory to radical leftists, regardless of whether or not it was put in law. That's what I said. And then the people who came after me said, oh, you must be transphobic and you'd mistreat a student in your class. It's like, I never mistreated a student in my class. I'm not transphobic, and that isn't what I said.
Well, except you've also called trans campaigners authoritarian, haven't you? I mean, isn't that
Well,
grossly
only in the
insen-
broader context of my claims that radical leftist ideologues are authoritarian.
And again, basically what Andrew Yang is saying that, well, they are authoritarian because this is sort of the limit of emancipation. And you can imagine that limit to sort of be the uppermost limit. Well, what is beyond that limit? Perhaps it's tyranny.
Yes,
which
but
they are.
You're saying someone who's trying to work out their gender identity, who may well have struggled with that, had quite a
No
tough
doubt
time
have
over the
struggled
years.
with it, yeah.
You're comparing them with, Chairman Mao, who
No, just the
saw the
activists.
deaths of millions of people. Well,
Just the
even if the
activists.
activists, they're trans people too. They have a right to say these things.
Yeah, but they don't have a
Isn't it
right to
grossly
speak for their whole
insensitive
community?
To compare them to Chairman Mao or, Pinochet, Augusto Pinochet. I mean, this is grossly insensitive. Isn't
I
it?
didn't compare them to Pinochet.
Well,
I did compare them to
He
Mao.
was an authoritarian.
He's a
wasn't he?
right-winger, though. I was comparing them to the left-wing totalitarians. And I do believe
Mao-
they are left-wing
Mao-
totalitarians.
Under Mao, millions of people died. I
Right.
mean, there's no comparison between
That's-
Mao and a trans activist, is there?
Why not?
Because trans activists aren't killing millions of people?
The philosophy that's guiding their utterances is the same philosophy.
And of course, if you wanted to hold to this, then don't compare someone to Hitler who hasn't killed 12 million people.
The consequences are...
Not yet.
You're saying that trans activists
No.
could lead to the deaths of millions of people? What
No,
they're
I'm
doing-
saying that the philosophy that drives their utterances is the same philosophy that already has driven us to the deaths of millions of people.
Okay, tell us how that philosophy is in any way comparable.
Sure, that's no problem. The first thing is that the philosophy presumes that group identity is paramount. That's the fundamental philosophy that drove the Soviet Union and Maoist China. And it's the fundamental philosophy of the left-wing activists. It's identity politics. It doesn't matter who you are as an individual. It matters who you are in terms of your group identity.
You're just
That's
saying these
murderous-
things, though, to provoke, aren't you? I mean,
Not
you
a
are a
bit.
provocateur.
I never said
You're like
anything-
the alt-right that you hate to be compared to. You want to stir things up.
I'm only a provocateur in...
You know, you are a provocateur. What exactly is that sentence doing? Again, this was sort of a masterful moment.
Gender, reach this kind of reductio ad absurdum of the emancipatory project, where we are redefining objective reality, biological reality, as itself a form of oppression that must be overcome. Like, we're going to run up against that threshold, and we're either going to cross it and undercut the very terms through which we can speak of emancipation, or that will be the Waterloo of this emancipatory project until such a time as we're able to design embryos in a womb, right? Or
And so that you then come to the point of saying, okay, what is the point of the emancipatory project? And is emancipation something that just goes on forever, or is emancipation a value that lives in an economy and an ecology with other values? Because of course, let's say cell division going on forever in my body would be called a cancer. A feedback loop that goes on forever isn't something we're looking for. Just saying, this reminded me of this passage I just read this afternoon I was working on my sermon, Richard Dawkins' theology of the book of Revelation. With the final scene around the throne of God and the Lamb, we are brought back to the central symbol of the whole book, the divine throne, and its combination of culture and political images, which first appeared in chapters 4 through 5. We should notice a contrast in chapters 4 through 5. In heaven, the living creatures form an inner circle of priests and immediate presence of God, and the 24 elders form an inner circle of thrones, sharing God's rule. They mediate the worship of the rest of creation. It's not worship of. Darn genitive can always go both ways. They mediate the worship of creation. They mediate the worship towards God from creation. There, we'll fix that genitive. In chapter 22, however, all who may enter the New Jerusalem have immediate access to God's throne on earth. They are priests who worship him and kings who reign with him. The earthly temple in Jerusalem, the high priest, once a year only wore the sacred name of God on his forehead and entered God's immediate presence in the Holy of Holies. In the New Jerusalem, which is God's eternal Holy of Holies, and that city four square. Wait to see what I do with it in the sermon. That city four square, of course, the Holy of Holies in the temple is a square. It's a cube. Well, in the New Jerusalem, which is God's eternal Holy of Holies, all will enjoy his immediacy without interruption. But nothing expresses this immediacy more evocatively than the words, "They shall see his face." This is the face of God that no one in mortal life could see and survive. But to see, which is the deepest human religious aspiration, to be realized only beyond this mortal life. A face expresses who a person is. To see God's face will be to know who God is in his personal being. This will be the heart of humanity's eternal joy in their eternal worship of God. As for the image of God's rule in the eschatological kingdom, what is most notable is the fact that all implication of distance between the one who sits on the throne and the world over which he rules has disappeared. His kingdom turns out to be quite unlike the beast's. It finds its fulfillment not in the subjection of God's servants to his will, but in their reigning with him. The point is not that they reign over anyone. The point is that God's rule over them is for them a participation in his rule. The image expresses the eschatological reconciliation of God's rule and human freedom, which is also expressed in the paradox that God's service is perfect freedom. Because God's will is the moral truth of our own being as his creatures, we shall find our fulfillment only when, through our free obedience, his will becomes also the spontaneous desire of our hearts. Therefore, in the perfection of God's kingdom, theonomy, God's rule, and human autonomy, self-determination, will fully coincide. This is what makes the irony of this particular debate so ironic, because of all groups of people to violate their principle of materialism, to cross the line with this issue, it's like you've got the biochemical markers of it. It's this religious dogma that supersedes their own religion. It in the end comes undone. Thus, Revelation's final use of its central image of God's throne frees it of all the associations of human rule, which must always have subjects, and makes it a pure symbol of theocentricity in its vision of human fulfillment. Going back on some of the other videos that I've made in the last few days, it's an interesting, one of the things that you see throughout the book of Revelation are there are these interesting, let's say, counterfeits that compare for a moment the ecstatic meditation of the monastic who seeks the beatific vision and the drug-addled teenager lying on the couch of his mother's basement. Are they experiencing bliss? Are they envisioning heaven? Well, one yes, one no. But it's a counterfeit. It's a corruption. It's a shortcut. And so then when you see what fulfillment is, this is part of the reason that we endlessly struggle with fulfillment. It's very difficult to judge another's religious path and their fulfillment, because struggles vary. And so I think it's an important work of love to be cautious, to, in many ways, not violate the freedom of the other in some deep fundamental way. And I think, with all of the talk about liberalism, that is one point in its favor, that it recognizes the inviolability of another person's freedom within certain confines. It has to be confined. There have to be limits. Otherwise, you get to the end of this emancipatory space, which will which will itself become its own tyrannical space. And the tyranny can come from outside or from inside or from our past or in many other ways. And that's where you get to God's service is perfect freedom, 1 Peter 2:16. Did this video help? I don't know. But I'm sure you'll let me know in the comments.